Without further ado, our topic or our discussion for today is job matching for improved return to work. So this is something that you may already do in some capacity. Maybe it's an informal thing or something that you have sort of, but I wanted to present an organization in it that will essentially help you be more efficient in your return to work process. We've presented on topics similar to this before for various webinars and at conferences and events. But I wanted to add in a piece on the cognitive side because I think that is something that many of our employers and clients are dealing with at the moment, or if you aren't yet, then it certainly is likely on the horizon for you. So I have added in some examples that are related to cognitive limitations and sort of how we can go about tackling those a little bit. By no means, I'm not a medical practitioner here. My goal is to sort of work with the employer to help them figure out how to match and or make accommodation if that's suitable. And so we're going to explore that part of our conversation today. But like I said, if you have questions, please ask as you go along. I would love to entertain them as we chat here. All right, so my plan for the day is pretty simple, short and sweet. We're going to talk briefly about injury statistics and what that means for us and ultimately why we want to spend so much time on job matching. And just as importantly, I'm going to talk about something called job coaching today because I think that is a potential transitional piece that a lot of folks are missing and could be a really integral part of your return to work program if used really well and properly. So I want to highlight some of the pieces of that and talk about how that might fit into your program if it's not a piece you're already exploring. And then I want to talk about the goals and objectives and just map out so we're all on the same page as a return to work program. They vary depending on the complexity or severity of the injury, what stage of the process the employee is at, but ultimately we sort of have a hierarchy system as to how we move through the goals or objectives of a return to work program. So we're just going to highlight those so we're all on the same page today as well. And that's sort of a very high-end overview of what I hope to achieve this afternoon. So these may not be the most current statistics. I didn't go back and double check that they are more current one available. And so these may not be exactly the most current ones, but they are within the last year or so. And ultimately, the message that I wanted to portray presenting you with this information of these statistics is really the prevalence of ergonomic injuries in the workplaces, right? And whether you are a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 employer, I know it all works a little bit differently depending on what type of employer you are. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, the numbers aren't that different, right? When we look at in terms of the prevalence of injuries for lost time claims, which are some of the more troublesome or more difficult and more expensive claims that we're looking at, those lost time claims really overexertion for Schedule 1 seems to be the #1 event or likely cause. And low back is one of the most common, is the most common injury site, followed by things like shoulder, hand, wrist, neck, etc. But low back is the most prevalent area. And you can see in Schedule 1, it's sprains and strains, overexertion, and low back. And if you do some quick sort of reading between the lines, that speaks a lot to ergonomic injuries, right? Ergonomic injuries are classified as sprains and strains. Now, there will be some injuries and sprains that are not ergonomic in nature, but when you pair that number, that 39%, with the concept that 17% of those are of the events that it occurs or causes them, which are overexertion in nature, then that gives you a sense as to what that these sort of things pair ergonomic injury is likely to be the main contributor to the sprain and strain. And then low back is one of those troublesome areas in our body. And if you've had someone with a low back injury before, you've probably struggled in some capacity to get them back to work, regardless of what job they do, right? People with an office job are going to struggle with return to work when they have a low back injury. Yes, we can provide them with a sit stand. Yes, we can get them to move more frequently throughout the day if we do that. But when it comes down to it, they may still struggle with both sitting and standing positions, depending on what their specific discomforts or injuries are. So that low back is a really tricky one. And then in Schedule 2, we see a same percentage or similar percentage of sprains and strains happening, but the most really matter what the event is that caused it, because if it's a low back, if it's a shoulder, if it's a hand, wrist, it doesn't matter whether they fell. It doesn't matter if it was an overexertion, traditional ergonomic injury. It doesn't matter if it was something else altogether. When we bring someone back, anytime they have a low back or a shoulder injury or any kind of physical injury, we have to work to accommodate them. And so, when we talk about these statistics, sometimes we talk about them from the preventative side, right? Our goal is to tackle those ergonomic injuries, so we reduce these statistics and these numbers. But if this is a reality for most people, or you're in this ballpark in some way, shape, or form, then really our goal today is to talk about how do we get these people who are going through these injuries and these illnesses, how do we get them back to work, and how do we do that most effectively? So one thing I like to highlight always, because I think it's just one of those numbers that we sometimes miss, is that when you look at injury costs, what a lot of folks calculate is really that category 1 stuff, which is the direct cost. And there's typically there's various ratios depending on which site you're reviewing and whatnot, but essentially what it suggests is that the direct costs are the things that are mostly easily quantifiable, right? They are medical costs, they are healthcare costs, they are wages you're paying not currently at work. If you're going through any kind of rehabilitation, your premiums are going up, etc. All of that is going to be a direct cost that you are incurring that is really easy to quantify, right? You can find those numbers, you can go around and search and pull all of those up, and you will get a really accurate or pretty accurate number as to what the direct cost of this injury is. But it's really the indirect costs that are that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's really the indirect costs that are the bulk of the injury costs here. And so what we look at in sort of a ratio is that for every $1 in direct costs, we probably spend an average of approximately $4 in indirect costs. And the ratios are somewhere around $3 to $4 usually, depending on which reference. So we're looking at $1 of direct costs to $3 to $4 of indirect costs, and these indirect costs are the drain on you, right? You have to do an accident investigation when someone gets injured. There's lots of paperwork. There's lots of follow-up with the employee. There's review of medical information. There's running around after employees and or doctors to get medical information. There's a lot of stuff happening in the background that we can't quantify, right? That's just part of my day-to-day job, and I don't actually have a number or a way to quantify or evaluate that as, accurately for this specific claim. And so those are the indirect costs, and they really add up fast. So, especially, we don't incur as many indirect costs when we get someone back to work perhaps quicker, right? Less time that they're off, hopefully the less indirect costs that we are incurring. So the sooner we can get someone back to work, the more we minimize some of these numbers to help manage our claim costs a little bit better. And that certainly is motivating for a lot of employers, the idea that, if we do a better job of this, we can ultimately save some dollars here. The bottom line is going to be improved by our injury cost reduction. And I don't know about you, but I think everybody, I think I speak for everybody when I say we would way rather be spending our money on proactive approaches to injury prevention than we would on reactive stuff related to disability management and return to work, right? That what this means is that an injury has happened, that this person life has been changed, whether it's for the short term as they recover, where it's for a long term, if they never are going to get back to full capacity, right? This person's life has changed, the employer has been impacted, the employee, perhaps their peers, their family. We obviously don't want to be spending our time in this environment or in this arena, but we do a lot, right? And so the better we get at managing these claims, the better we get at managing these costs. And for me, if we're not talking dollars and cents, if that's not really your thing, the better we get at supporting our employees and our employers and our management and our peers through this process. And that really is where I see the most value in a truly good return to work program. So goals and objectives of back to work usually, like I said, come in a hierarchy or a system, right? Most times, and traditionally the WSIB's alignment has been in this category, is that the goal and objective of a return to work plan is first and foremost to get the employee back to their pre-injury job, right? That is first and foremost the goal or the purpose of this process, is to try and get them back to their pre-injury job in exactly the way it was done, or maybe you modify it permanently, but without ideally get this person back to their pre-injury job. If we have to accommodate them back into it, they can't do 100% of their job, but maybe they can do 85 or 90%, and I can figure out how to accommodate that last 10 or 15%, then we are looking at a modified or accommodated pre-injury job. But the goal first always to figure out how that pre-injury job continues to be a possible and a suitable option for this individual. Certainly, less relevant, we're talking about a short-term accommodation, right? Bringing someone back quickly to try and get them back, continue them being a meaningful part of the workforce. Perhaps they move to a different job temporarily, but there are long-term goals and objectives. It's always working towards that pre-injury job. If that's not suitable, maybe short-term accommodation, then we may be looking at alternate jobs in the workplace. And again, for your sake, as well as for the employees, we don't want to make a job just to get this person back to work. We want to find an alternate job that is suitable for them, ideally with no accommodation or with minimal accommodation, right? We don't want to have someone come back to a job that is effectively meaningless because it is so heavily accommodated. They're only doing 20% of the actual position or the task. And so the ideal would be to find something that they can do that is a full job. One full-time employee or whoever, one employee has to do this job. And so this is the ideal match if we get there, right? So that's sort of the hierarchy. If we have to accommodate someone into an alternate job, we do. And then there are some other objectives, right? Depending on the employer, depending on the employee, doctors, case managers, etc. There are lots of people involved in this conversation, but you may, in the end, come up with something else that is suitable. And I've seen all kinds of things that fit into this other category, but I would describe a lot of them as those make-work positions, right? I've seen people who primarily work on the floor doing production type work, right? Operating a press or a machine in an office, filing paperwork. And is that a job that needs to get done? Yes. Is that meaningful and value added to the employer and or the employee? I don't know. If someone else would do the filing because it's normally part of their job and this person's just doing it because they don't have anything else to do, then that's not necessarily meaningful work. And everybody feels that, right? The employee who's trying to return to work feels that, the employer feels that. And so we're really not necessarily finding good, valuable tasks for them to do when we get to that how do we make a job sort of conversation. Sometimes we do a great job of that, sometimes we do not, right? And so those are sort of, for me, the hierarchy of how we would work through this return to work process. Hopefully, nothing about that is a surprise to you so far. So the concept of a job match assessment sort of arises from this idea of trying to get someone back to an existing job, right? That's really what it comes down to. You can also do a job match for a job that you've created for someone, but most often when we get asked to be involved in the job match process, ideally what we're doing is trying to figure out whether their pre-existing job or an alternate job at the facility that is in their scope or their realm of abilities is a good, suitable match for their physical and or cognitive limitations. So we're really looking for whether that match exists. Is there any of the parts of the position that are outside their capabilities? Now, this is where I said I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive demands as well, too, because I thought this was a relevant part of the conversation. So we're going to talk about physical assessment or physical demands assessments and cognitive demands assessments and how we use those as part of the job match assessment process. And then also the role of the SAF form in this process, or the independent medical examination, or even maybe more generic doctor's note with some information about what the employee can and can't do. Whatever basically medical information you have that outlines that employee's abilities is going to be the foundation, the backbone to building this job match assessment. Without it, we can't really figure out if there's a match. So we're going to start by talking about the physical functional abilities form. So, and I call it a physical, traditionally this would just be called the functional abilities form. I'm going to highlight a cognitive one as well today. So that's why I called this one a physical, but this is what you would know and have used before for a functional abilities form, right? This is the WSIB form. You may have your own, but we see this quite commonly. And so you would get back information from a medical practitioner, whether it's a GP or a more specific or specialized practitioner. It really depends on the individual, who you can get a hold of, et cetera. Obviously, the more objective information, the better. We all know that and have had terrible FAS filled out before, but ultimately we want to talk about, we want to review all the data that is in there, right? The goal is to gather what the employee can and can't do, and then move forward with figuring out whether the job that we're offering them fits the bill for those things. So some examples of common things you would see on a functional abilities form are lifting limits or carrying limits or pushing and pulling limits would be very normal. So can't lift more than 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 20 pounds. It's not often that we climb much more than 20 or 25 pounds. Usually once you get up that high, then if it's a shoulder or back injury, that's probably outside of most recovering individuals' abilities. So they usually give you some kind of weight. Those ones are pretty objective, generally speaking. You might get something like can't work above shoulder height or reach above shoulder level, for example, would be another common statement. Occasional right shoulder reaching in front of the body. Well, that's a little bit more subjective. We have to figure out what that word occasional means. You might get a word like rare thrown in there. I didn't actually put it on this list, and I totally should have. Another statement that we all know and love is right shoulder reaching in front of the body as tolerated. That as tolerated statement is everybody's favorite because it's almost impossible to come up with a return to work plan because we don't know what that employee is going to be able to tolerate. They really haven't given us an actual functional ability or ability for them to move or do this work. So that becomes really challenging. When we go through and look at these words like occasional and rare, if you've not heard us speak to this before, I just want to make sure we highlight this today, is that those words aren't entirely arbitrary, right? It's not just occasional, isn't just a number you kind of go, oh, I guess that's 20% or less is, occasional. What we usually connect those to, and the WSIB would certainly recognize as an acceptable approach to this, is to say, okay, the most common things you see are rare, occasional, frequent, and constant. Or would be the four most common terminology, or never, obviously, and that one's pretty clear. But rare usually refers to something that occurs for 1 to 5% of your day, and then occasional would be 6 to 33% of your day. Frequent would be 34 to 66% of your day, and then everything over the 66%. 67 to 100 would be considered constant. And those numbers, those ranges are not random. They are the NIOSH frequencies. So we use those ranges as our reference points. So when you get that subjective data like occasional in your SAF, you're going to translate that to mean 6 to 33%. So therefore, if you have a job that requires less than 33% right shoulder reaching, for example, then you have a suitable accommodation, right? Then that is a suitable task moving forwards for that individual. So that's how we start to marry or use that subjective language to transition it to something a little more objective that we can work with and actually work towards as a goal, rather than trying to guesstimate as to what occasional might mean. So we do make those references and connections, and that's acceptable practice. So if you aren't doing that currently, that's just a good tip or things to use moving forward. This is a sample or example of a small section of our PDA that we use. And I just wanted to bring that up to talk a little bit about PDAs and how good, bad, and ugly they are, and ultimately how effective they can be in your return to work process. I think this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks or hurdles I see some of our clients working with. If they've not done PDAs with us, because ours are quite detailed and very objective and provide lots of information with the goal and the purpose that these are going to be used for accommodations. So we want to give you as much information as you possibly can get for ammunition and tools when you go forward with accommodating someone or a job match process. But you get a lot of, I didn't include a sample here, but maybe I should have it. You get a lot of ones that are potentially checklist based, check boxes specifically, actually, is what you see a lot. And it'll say things like, it'll say lifting less than 5 kilograms occurs, and then you might have to check rarely, seldom, or occasional, frequent, and constant, for example. You might even have an opportunity to give some examples as to what the things they list are. But when you get to a checkbox-based PDA, what you lose is some of that really true objective detail. So when we fill out a PDA, you can see, I think you can see already that without the checkbox system, you actually get a lot more information here, right? So when we look at, lifting heights, we talk about below knuckle, knuckle to shoulder, above shoulder. Again, we pick those for a reason. We pick them because those are common reference points a medical practitioner might use in that SAF. So when they say above shoulder lifting, very common. Below knuckle or maybe even below knee would be another option that you might get in there as a statement. We're trying to give a bit of a range so you can figure out pretty quickly without having to sift through all this lifting information. Very quickly, somebody says, oh, there's above shoulder, you know, this person can't lift above shoulder. I hop into this job and go, you know what? There is no above shoulder lifting because I've got that clearly spelled out here without having to sift through any of the other lifting data at all, because it's not relevant. The relevant point is matching the physical ability, and in this case, it's no above shoulder lifting. Well, great, we've already got a match. There's actually nothing we need to do here to accommodate or modify this task. If that's the only restriction, this is a perfect job that this person could potentially go back to. Right? And so we try and really give a lot of detail in that PDA, and I would encourage you to explore your PDA a little bit more, just to make sure that any PDAs that you have are really working for you. And if they're not, you have to question whether they're worth continuing using, whether they're worth exploring other options that are out there, because a good PDA does a world of difference in terms of speed and efficiency of your job match process, because it gives you the good detail you need to be able to quickly and efficiently move through figuring out what specific limitations this person has and whether this job requires those tasks or not. I wanted to also highlight today the idea of a cognitive FAF, or cognitive functional abilities form. I've shared with you the City of Mississauga's template that they've been working with the last several years, and this is something that we did a bunch of CDAs, job demands assessments, physical and cognitive demands assessments for Mississauga, and they took those and ultimately decided to develop their own FAF form, essentially, specifically not getting, they were struggling to get some great information about cognitive limitations from the medical practitioners that were coming back with data from with what these employees can or can't do. And so they thought, you know what, we need to get more objective information here. We need to get have them actually review a whole host of potential cognitive limitations or abilities. And all these statements that are in here, you can see, hopefully you can see, it's a bit small, like ability to self-supervise, ability to supervise others, for example, are direct connections to sections in the cognitive demands assessment we developed for them. So if Dr. checks off full abilities, the concept is that perfect, we've got a match, because whatever this employee self-supervises a lot, for example, they don't really have self-direction around all the time. They are working, generally speaking, on their own. If they have full ability to do that, then this is a great match already, and we can move forward. If they have a limited ability to supervise others, and they are a manager or a director, well, now we're going to have to explore whether that's even possible to accommodate them into, because if they can't supervise others, but they're a manager of people, well, now we're going to have a difficult time finding a match with the current role and responsibility, right? So they thought, you know what, this is a good tool or resource to have to roll out, again, be more efficient in their process. They have this cognitive demands assessment, describes what the job is cognitively, and they wanted a document back from the doctor that it essentially directly matched up. So when they get this back, they can look at their FAF form that they've got and say, okay, in this section, the doctor says, full abilities, awesome, moving forward. In this section, these are the limitations. Here's the comments the doctor had. Now we can start to review that section of the cognitive demands assessment and figure out if there's a match or not. So cognitive FAF is still not something I see often. It's not something I see with all kinds of different clients. We have a couple that have developed them and are using them quite effectively. I would encourage you, as you start to develop or experience more mental health limitations or cognitive limitations in your workforce, to consider going this route. Having a form like this that directly speaks to the cognitive demands assessments that hopefully you have or will have as you go through this process can really be helpful just to get good quality information and comprehensive information from the medical practitioner that's evaluating this individual. Examples of some statements that you might, if you've never had a cognitive limitation come back from a medical practitioner, I pulled out some examples of ones that we've seen from some of our clients. Some are more objective and more information packed than others. You get a lot of subjective here, but sometimes you get some really good information. So, for example, the first one I pulled out was difficulty with orientation. So they had trouble navigating, getting around. They would get turned around easily and confused. But if this person was primarily an office-based individual and really didn't have to go a whole lot of other places, well, that wasn't really a huge factor for them, right? So we can do some things to accommodate maybe they, work in a difficult to access part of the building. We can do some things to accommodate to make sure they can, comfortably get in and out of that space. Is the bathroom accessible? As we can do some things to accommodate those types of pieces. But if there's someone who drives for a living, like if they are a technician on the road, if they are a public works operator driving to and from all kinds of job sites, those are people are gonna. That's where this limitation is going to become much more problematic to try and navigate. Yes, there are maps and navigation systems to help. That would be a question that we need to ask. If we provide them with this, that, or the other, will that effectively mitigate the issue or the concern here? Or do they need, or is that going to, continue to be a problem that hasn't actually managed the risk? So, we might have to explore something like that. Attention span might be a factor. Obviously, most of the jobs that we have out there require some moderate to significant amount of attention, regardless of what you're doing. If you're operating a press in a factory, you have to pay lots of attention to make sure everything gets installed properly, as well as you are safe throughout the process, because we're talking about operating some pretty serious equipment here. And so you need to be safe throughout the process, but you may also, somebody working in administrative assistant, and you're operating a front desk, answering phone calls, taking information in and trying to look stuff up on a computer, provide feedback or direction, even linking calls to other people, as a receptionist might. You're still going to see require a lot of attention to detail, right? So if they can't manage that, then that's going to be difficult. Also should speak directly to the SAS, right? Ones that are a little easier to navigate maybe is things like difficulty expressing themselves during in-person interactions. Well, I can figure out pretty quickly how often or how likely this person is going to have in-person interactions. If they're still pretty good on the phone or online or other places, because it's the confrontational element of like being in person with someone, then I might be able to manage that really well, right? It's that gives me some very specific information. We have seen something like that as well, right? That gives you that detailed information. So depending on what ideally, I think you're using some sort of form or standardized system to grab information from your medical practitioner, because it does connect to, in theory, your cognitive demands assessment if you have them. So let's take a look at a cognitive demands assessment, because that's the next piece of this process. So a cognitive demands assessment typically describes the cognitive demands of the job. It is not talking about the individual at all. I'm not referring to an employee. I'm not evaluating them. I'm not assessing their abilities here. I am strictly saying this is what the job requires. So we did a payroll benefits coordinator at a local municipality. And so we went through, and these are some examples of some of the pieces that we had to review, right? So we looked at what type of memory, or not what type, but when is memory required in their job? Is it good questions to ask here, because it helps you with accommodation later. I think, like, do they actually have to remember it? Is there a step-by-step instruction sheet somewhere? Oftentimes there is, because we need to train someone new potentially. So we often have instruction sheets that tell us how to do things, and it's not always practical to access them. And that's the second question here. But the first question is, do we truly need to remember this or not? Maybe we don't. And if we don't, then because there's something available, we need to question how practical it is to access that on a regular basis. And if we can achieve that, answer is, well, it's pretty practical to achieve this. There's really no reason, right? They need to access the system and take these, 10 different, be able to do these 10 different actions within this program, this computer program. I can provide step-by-step instructions on how to do that, right? That would be a pretty common way that you could potentially accommodate someone. So you need to explore that a little bit more. And you may have to dive in and ask them additional questions or clarifications of the employee's medical practitioner, saying, okay, these are the suitable accommodations. Like, this becomes a bit of a partnership, right? These are the suitable accommodations we think are going to be suitable to manage these things that we see in their workplace. What feedback do you have on those? Do you think is going to effectively manage the concerns or the issues this person is having while they're at the workplace? Is there anything additional that we can be doing that you can think of off the top of your head, and try and sort of build that relationship and that conversation up, because these are tricky. They're complicated. They are difficult. They vary day to day depending on how that person is feeling, how much they've slept, what kind of interactions they've had, how their day started, just how they're feeling in the morning when they get out of bed, right? Like, all these things are going to impact how they're able to manage their day and effectively complete all the tasks assigned to them. So that bit of a flux nature to cognitive limitations, it's something that we need to just be mindful of and talking about as we go through this accommodation process is that the more we involve that medical practitioner, the better our accommodation will get, and the better we'll get at it, especially if you come across a medical practitioner that is that happens to be really helpful or useful. Sometimes we come across ones that are amazing, other times less helpful. We've all been there before. But if you get one that's really good, asking all those questions and getting that clarification and better understanding will just make you better at it in the future as well, right? Using them as a bit of a resource as you go along to make sure that you are learning as much as possible from that experience so that you can do a better job of those cognitive accommodations in the future. So one of the questions we get asked a lot, so going back to the cognitive demands assessment, one of the questions we get asked a lot is, well, you know what, when I read some of the descriptions, there's a little bit of subjectivity in there. You're not saying it happens 5 minutes of an hour, 10 minutes of an hour, as if you would do that with a physical demands assessment. I would quantify all of that. And the problem with that approach is that it's incredibly difficult to do. It's easy for some, like for example, reading will be in here, or writing will be in here, some of the cognitive requirements of the job. Interacting with the public might be in there, right? Exposure to confrontational situations. Those ones we can get a pretty good sense of how frequently they might occur, because people get a sense of, you know, how often they actually talk to somebody throughout the day. I would talk to someone for approximately 20% of my workday on average. I might cap out at about 40% depending on my day. Great, those are good numbers to have. But when we get down to things like problem solving, using your memory, attention to detail, those ones are very difficult to quantify that way, right? Because I can't see it, right? It's not like a physical demand where I can take a stopwatch out and time you how frequently your shoulder is in front of your body, right? I can't do that with a cognitive demand. And so we explore it out more through the comments. And then what we do to objectify it or to create that objectivity in it is we connect it to the essential duties of the job. And so this is which should be an integral part of any physical or cognitive demands assessment that you complete. But the essential duties become super important here as you explore the cognitive demands assessment component, because this is where you're going to make those connections to how frequently things occur. So, for example, I've pulled just the essential duties page for an HR and accessibility coordinator. So an administrative position primarily, right? They do almost all entire administrative work with the occasional meeting or other trainings or whatnot, as they're listed on the bottom. But day-to-day work for about 7 to 8 hours per shift, performing administrative work. And then we broke that down into clerical and reporting. So these are your WSIB forms, reports, create job postings, sort of the more technical nature of what they do. Then we talked about communications. Obviously, this person is HR and accessibility. They're going to talk to a lot of people, right? They have to talk to employees. They're going to talk to WSIB. They do some training. This is the municipalities. They may be speaking to other municipal counterparts to get feedback and information from one another, use each other as resources. So there's a lot of communication happening as part of their role. And then they also do quite a bit of research in the background. This person's specific role was about, you know, they're developing policies and procedures. They're not always actually writing or documenting it. They're doing all the research in behind it. So doing a lot of reading and gathering information. So we broke essentially their 7 to 8 hours of day is all administrative, yes, but let's explore what that administrative looks like. And so we got to about 3.5 hours of their 7 hours, so about 50% of their day, they're doing clerical reporting work. About 50% of their day, they're doing program or initiative research, and they're actually communicating for only somewhere around, you know, 10% of their day, guesstimated. Right? It may not be a perfect number, but that's sort of the ballpark, 40 to 50% the other two. And then when I go through and I look at the cognitive demands assessment, we've created some of our newer cognitive demands that we've made some modifications over the last little while, but this is where we start to make those connections and really build that match. Is that if, you know, I didn't put the match of the two together, and I probably should, but if we're doing it for this job here, it would say clerical and reporting, communications, and program and initiative research here instead of the payroll one that I'm using as my example, right? It would have those listed, and it would check off when those things are required. So does this person have to use their memory while they're doing program, initiative, and research? Probably not, right? That they are reading content as they go along, saving and downloading. They can easily be making notes as part of that process. so that they don't have to remember it all. They can sort and organize their notes so that it's all in like a one-stop shop. So if they need to go back and review anything, they don't have to remember where they read that piece of information or found that source. It should all be gathered into documentation. So there are ways that they can eliminate memory. So when we come to this section, we maybe wouldn't check memory off, check that off for memory. It's not really required during that programmer research component, but it is potentially required or likely required during some of the clerical pieces. They're going to need to remember procedures. They're going to need to remember information about the, completing WSIB forms, what happened, what information about the accident investigation. Some of it will be referenceable, but some of it will not. And so that might be a requirement, and maybe not during communication, maybe unless they have to take notes after the fact, right? So that's essentially, we take that and say, okay, you know what? They actually only require memory for about half their job, because we said it's required during clerical and reporting, or at least percentage of that. And it's somewhat required in the communication section as well. So now I get a sense of that frequency element, right, that is required for about 40 to 50% of this person's job. Is an estimate. It's not perfect because I can't physically observe someone using their memory, right? But it is going to make that connection and build those two pieces together so I can get a pretty good sense of how often this is occurring. So that's really how that marriage of essential duties and cognitive demands help you move forward with building that job match. Because if you get something back that says this person can only occasionally problem solve, that's a bad example, right? But has only difficulty with memory, right? So they're going to struggle with recalling things. You need to quickly figure out what essential duties require memory. Well, this part tells you right here. You can go back to the essential duties and say, oh, well, memory occurs. And we're estimating somewhere around 30 to 40% of their day. So it's going to be difficult to accommodate those pieces out without starting to look at, we now need to start to explore options. Can we provide lists or checklists or other information to give them those triggers so they don't have to remember? Right? So we explore those as potential solutions at that point. So that's the marriage of those essential duties and cognitive demands. And then a little bit about how we connect it back to the functional abilities information that hopefully we're getting about their cognitive abilities. So I have a few more slides here, but I wanted to just touch base. How are we doing with questions? I actually just saw a question pop up, so let's pull that out so I can answer it. If you have any other ones, I know some of this stuff will be quite new for some folks. So if you have questions, now is a good time to ask them here. So one of my questions is, how do you know that your estimate would be an accurate representation of the job? Would you watch one person for an 8-hour shift, give approximate time with tasks that match? Good question. So how do you know that your estimates are an accurate representation of the job? Your essential duties breakdown should be a pretty accurate representation of the job. And when we complete them, I will tell you I do not observe someone for 8 hours. We determine this based on several factors. Absolutely observation. I'm with them for sure for at least 2 hours, sometimes quite a bit more depending on how complex this piece is. But I would break it down. I would use their you do it based on interview to some degree, right? You can use some more objective measurements, like people's calendars are actually super helpful here, right? They often break it down based on, you could get a snapshot of their calendar over the past 2 months and get a sense of what percentage of time they were in meetings, what types of meetings, especially if they use some of the tasks that they have. That might be really valuable or interesting information. So you can use some of that stuff to break it down. There's lots of ways you can gather this. I mean, I would say our primary routes are observation and then interview, and make sure that your interview is matching your observation. So if you're saying, you know what, tell me a little bit about when you use your memory, what are the specific tasks, et cetera, they start listing that, and you say, okay, great. I am observing that those tasks occurred for about 15, 20 minutes of our time together today. So is that pretty representative of what it would normally be? Staff are usually pretty good at that. And the other benefit or the other opportunity maybe, Catherine, is that if you have multiple people doing the same role, you're certainly going to want to catch both of them and to take a quick observation and make sure that what you saw with one person is representative of what the other person also does. Because sometimes one person reports something and somebody else reports something quite different. And so you just want to make sure that you've reviewed and married all of those things together. And if there is a big discrepancy, then you want to dive a little deeper. And if they're right on par with one another, and you'd be surprised how often that's the case actually, is that you could be pretty confident that those numbers are fairly accurate. So you're going to do a lot of interview here and observation to sort of match those two things up. But I could not spend 8 hours with someone, primarily because in an 8-hour shift, you might also not see everything that they do, right? Depending on what their job role is. Someone on a production floor, you're probably going to see everything they do in 15 minutes or 2 hours, depending on how long their cycle is. So if you're talking about somebody in an administrative role, they might, a payroll person is really busy at month end, and stuff they do at month end they won't do at the beginning of the month, right? So there's going to be a bit of a cycle to it. So you would almost have to go back and be there on multiple days to capture different things. So you have to sort of work to gather all that information together. Question is, are you able to share cognitive demands assessment and the functional abilities form for the cognitive functional abilities form? And I can. We have been given permission to share out that the functional abilities form for the cognitive, and I can certainly send you a sample cognitive demands assessment as well as part of our. We do send out a recording of the webinar after the fact, and I can include those with that email as well if that would be helpful. All right. So let's hop back here. If you have any other questions, throw them in there. That is all I have at the moment. So we'll continue along here. Really, when it comes, the sort of the final steps of this process are the job matching piece, right? Is actually figuring out how, taking the information you get from the medical practitioner about what this employee can or can't do, and then making a match. So I pulled an example of what I've actually done just to get a sense of what this looks like. It's also one that probably most people can picture, or at least picture pieces of. So this individual came back and they had limited lifting ability, so they couldn't lift more than 10 kilograms, right? So about 20 odd pounds, 22 pounds. They had restricted behind the back or twisting of the thorax. They had, could only work above shoulder level as tolerated. There's our favorite two words, right? And then limited pushing and pulling with both arms. So those were this individual's restrictions. And they were actually an arena operator. So they spent their time in an arena doing all kinds of different tasks. So their job would involve cleaning change rooms and facility, cleaning glass, operating the Zamboni, edging the ice, etc. Right? All kinds of different things that this person does. So we essentially then went through all the different tasks and figured out what there was a match for and what there wasn't. So, I highlighted the pieces in particular that were the most difficult. So I just pulled a page where I happen to have a lot of did not match things. But we looked at, okay, can this person change the Zamboni blades, right? So at some point, not daily, but, occasionally, they have to change this Zamboni blades. The blades are 43 pounds. Well, this person's only able to lift 22 pounds, and so that is going to mean that this task is not suitable for them. And then the other part of this is that there's several bolts to undo in order to take the blade off and put the new one on, and that would require too many awkward postures because it's done at a terrible height, like down below your knee height, and it requires too much probably pushing and pulling on the actual wrench to get the bolts loosened and tightened. That would probably exceed their guidelines as well. So, so then in that case, we're looking and exploring, is this something that can be organized or sorted so that it happens on someone else's shift, right? So this person is not the only arena operator. It happens about once a week. So if we know this is coming, can the work be organized such that this person doesn't have to be responsible for this task, right? That's the question that we explored with that one, because it has to get done, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done by this person on this shift if we organize work really well. Next one was exploring ice maintenance, so edging and chopping, so taking off those little ridges at the around the boards. So it's out the manual chopping tool, like the sharp blade. It requires a bit of a bend to the side, as well as the force required to actually to hit the boards with it to get that ice chopped off. So it's not suitable. So the question was, again, is somebody else available to do that? Can they edge more frequently? There was different things that we explored as potential solutions to that task, but there is potential accommodation there as well, right? So this person can still do about half the task, and chopping is not done every day either, right? They only do it when there's a buildup. And so if, again, work is organized well, can this be done on someone else's shift? Probably, right? And then we start to explore different solutions. So this is how we sort of piece those things together. We take all those objective measurements that we have from the physical demands assessment, we throw them into a bit of a job match and say, is this a match to this person's ability or not? And we explore each one of those individually, trying to figure out what our potential accommodation solutions are. All right, just to give you a sense of sort of what this might look like. Going back to my original statement is that we're trying to focus on our pre-injury job or our modified or accommodated pre-injury job, right? That's the goal, and that's what we're trying to achieve. So when we look at our next steps, we are trying ultimately to compare the person's physical limitations to their pre-injury job. That should be the start of our job match process, right? Is do these things actually match? And if they do, great. If they don't, can we accommodate them? And we're going to explore all of that with their existing jobs first, right? And then once we know that it's a match, great, we're moving forward with whatever accommodations we need. And if it's not, then we're going to move on to those other questions and conversations, right? But first, we're going to explore this job match process with their pre-injury job, right? Especially if we aren't sure, and that's often the case, right? I'm not, you know, it's an external person coming in to complete this assessment. I don't know all the finer nuances of every job, so I need to better understand. You're probably in much of the same boat, right? We need to get out there, take a look, evaluate, review, make sure that that what we're getting from a functional abilities information is objectively documented in our PDA, and we're able to figure out that match or common advanced assessment. Right? And then if we don't get there, we start to move on to those other jobs. We either have a job in the workplace that we're looking at, we might have an accommodated position in the workplace we're looking at, or we might be getting to the point where we're making a job or a position and assembling the different pieces together to make a job or a position. And that would be sort of our last alternative, as we discussed. So when we talk about alternate jobs that we explore, we want to, just things to sort of food for thought here is that we want to avoid those light duty jobs, right? That we see, it's getting less and less common, thankfully, but we still see it on occasion that that a facility has what they would describe as a light duty job. And so this sometimes is a light duty area, like you see that most commonly in like a manufacturing facility. There's a light duty area that if it's a job that actually needs to be done, for example, a quality inspection of some kind that requires them to, you know, instead of doing the manual assembly, they are inspecting, that doesn't require a lot of movement of heavy tools or equipment or pieces and significantly impaired posture, exams, et cetera, then that area is a value-added area. But it isn't really a light-duty job, right? It's actually a job at the facility that we're trying to accommodate someone into. And that's really the direction I would encourage you to try to go. Is try to build a bit of a cache of jobs that are suitable for various injuries or cognitive limitations. For example, if you thought probably not that hard right now, but if you thought right now for a few minutes and thought, you know what, is there a job at my facility that if somebody gets injured, that gets a shoulder injury, is there a suitable job for them to go back to? Depending on where you work, a hospital, and you're talking about that might be more difficult because their scope of care is very different and there are some limitations there. But if you're talking about a factory, then there probably is jobs that are more physically demanding to the shoulder and things that are less physically demanding to the shoulder. So we can go through those jobs ahead of time and build up a little list of, you know what, these 5 jobs are very commonly suitable for shoulder injuries because there's not a lot of shoulder activity required in them. There might be lots of hand-wrist activity, there might be lots of back, right? Maybe there's lots of neck activity, but if that's not related to this person's restrictions, then it's irrelevant really in the job accommodation process. What we're trying to focus on is this person comes back and they can't reach, and they ultimately can't reach, they can't work above shoulder height, they can't reach more than 10 or 15 inches in front of their body before their shoulders in that position that's unsafe or unsecure for them. Then we want to evaluate, we want to have jobs on hand that quickly say, you know what, I've got the perfect job for you. This is the one that we're going to move you back into. You can be back on the floor tomorrow because we've got a job that's suitable for your shoulder. Same thing could happen for your wrist or your hand. Same thing could happen for your back. You can do this for every body part. I would encourage you to choose the body focus, especially if this is not something you've been doing historically, to pick your most common injury sites. If shoulder is your problem, then I would spend some time trying to review and figure out where you have potential accommodations for shoulder, and then use that sort of as a jumping point because you know that's going to be stuff you're going to use very quickly, and it's going to give you a quick return on your investment of time to sort out which jobs are possible. And you're also going to work on the accommodations that are possible for those jobs. Chances are good you've already accommodated some people into those positions. Have you taken the time, or do you have some sort of record of documentation or a way of centralizing that information to say, you know what, these are some accommodations that we have been successful implementing on job A or job B or job C or in this work area. right? And so that would give you a pretty good sense as to whether you can do that again, right? And I would do this for both physical and cognitive limitations. I might even document things you've tried to accommodate for someone, or like an accommodation you've tried that hasn't worked, right? Because you don't want to go back and try it again later because you've forgotten, or more time has passed, or everybody's forgotten, or you have too many to do and you don't have some of the finer details documented. So I would go and work on a good list of accommodations as well. And I would probably not starting from scratch here. I would build it based on, as we come up with an injury or an illness that we're trying to accommodate, what accommodations were we able to do in this position in order to successfully bring this person back to work. So that's just like little things that you could be doing to be more proactive and more efficient in your process, right? You've got a plan as to how you're going to get there. You've got the right documentation in place so that when you do have an injury, you know exactly how you're going to tackle it. I've got my job demands assessment, describes my physical and my cognitive limitations. I've got my abilities, my employee's abilities. I'm making the job match. I'm building my accommodation list. And you can be ready to get someone back to work within, hopefully, 24 hours, maybe even, maybe a few more days than that. But I had a client that actually their goal, a large manufacturer, a large production facility, a food production facility, their goal was to have everyone back to work within 24 hours. So if somebody went off work on a Tuesday, the expectation is that that company was prepared with a suitable job for accommodation on Wednesday morning, so that there was really very little lag time between when this person went off and when they received a suitable accommodation job. And to do that, they had to really work hard at this stuff, right? They had to have that cache of jobs. They had to know exactly what was likely to be a very suitable accommodation for a shoulder injury, which jobs had very little shoulder activity, because they really needed to know that, so they didn't have any lag time in trying to figure any of that information out, right? So that job list that you can generate when you do start to explore down past those pre-existing the person's pre-injury job gives you some good information as well. All right, I want to highlight a couple things today just before we go. The employee is back to work, which is awesome. Now what? How do we work on easing the transition back to work and increase our odds of a successful accommodation, right? Because it's about early and safe return to work, and obviously both of those things are dependent on this person being successful in the process. So I wanted to explore just one option that we have been working with some clients on that I think is super valuable and is still not being used extensively enough in industry, in any industry at this point, and that's the idea of job coaching. When we picture job coaching, you might picture like training someone from the outset on how to do their job, right? Like the onboarding type job coaching. But I'm really talking about job coaching as a tool for return to work here today. So what we can do with job coaching is really cool. Typically, we're talking about one-on-one coaching, especially when we're talking about return to work job coaching. We want to work with that person to educate on safe work practices and body mechanics, specifically focusing on their limitations. People are not always as aware of their bodies as you might think, right? So they get a doctor's note that says that they can't work above shoulder height, for example, and then you catch them on the floor again and again and again working above shoulder height, and you're like, what are you doing? You can't do that, right? Your doctor said you can't do that. And they're like, yeah, great, okay, yeah. And but it's like this weird moment where they just don't seem to be aware enough about their body or about the positions that they're putting their body into. And so the goal is to educate them through some one-on-one coaching, right? To provide them with that feedback. This works amazingly well in, just in any environment, but some of the places I've seen it the most successful are places where the work is pretty structured or organized, right? That doesn't necessarily be a factory that has a 30-second cycle time. It can work great in a hospital setting where you have a nurse or an RPN, someone who has a routine sort of to their day, right? They're going on medications, they are doing rounds, they're doing vital checks, et cetera, and they're working their way through their traditional list, through their various patient loads. And so you'll be able to work with them on each of those different components of their task. Right? You've got like 4 or 5 different main tasks that this person does. And so if you work to coach them through how they stay within their restrictions, how they minimize the amount of activity to the specific joint sites that are of concern, what are their opportunities, can they do it with their left hand, with their right hand, and you could just work with them through all of this. It's a really interesting opportunity to provide them with some great education and really bridge that gap, right, that it's going to ease that transition. It's trying to make it okay that this is our expectation. I'm very clearly spelling out what I want you to do moving forward. I'm not leaving any ambiguity as to what this is going to look like. And basically I'm asking you telling you exactly, this is how I want you or expect you to be able to perform this task, and working with them on that, right? Getting their feedback. Is this possible? What do you observe? Is this something that you're going to be challenged by? We have said some really interesting, some examples. This is actually me up doing an assessment with someone who was a heavy equipment operator, obviously, right? And so they are moving things around in a warehouse with this piece of equipment. And so in this case, I was working with this individual who was coming back to work, and we had deemed that this job was suitable, but only suitable if they achieve the ideal setup within their piece of equipment, right? And so the part of the job coaching process was to actually spend time with them, making sure that their seating and their controls and all the adjustability that's present in the cab of that vehicle was properly set up to the employee, and explaining and working with them and coaching them on how to set that up properly each day, because this wasn't a dedicated piece of equipment. Somebody operated it to, for their morning shift, but then someone else came in the afternoon and would operate it. So they would come back in every morning and have to reset all of this stuff. And so it was important that they understood why, how it protected them. They were coached through how to do it. Then I went in and I adjusted all of it to fit me, because I was very different in height to them. Then I hopped back out and they got back in and they went through all the adjustments again. But all of that is that coaching and feedback loop, and really working one-on-one with the employee to make sure they knew how to protect themselves and work within their abilities and their restrictions. And you can do this with all kinds of tasks, but that one-on-one coaching element can be such a valuable return to work tool that if you aren't using it, it's something to explore a little bit more and better understand how it might fit or work for you. So I got a couple of examples. There's me actually again there on that piece of equipment. You could be coaching someone, for example, on how to use a lift assist. That's just a stock photo that we pulled. The one on the left is actually the organization of a cook. Another return to work assessment I did. There was a chef at a school, actually, and so they were at a college or university, and a chef at that school does all kinds of prep work to get ready for the classes that need the actual culinary classes. And so this is examples of all their storage areas. So things that we need to explore with them is how is it organized? Is it organized properly? What do you access most frequently? You're not supposed to work above shoulder height. Well, several of these bins are above shoulder height. So let's make sure that you know exactly which bins are above shoulder height. We even put a marking on the shelf. So anything above this shelf as a visual reminder is stuff that this individual was not supposed to access. Then we spent time exploring what they access most frequently and made sure we got it into the areas that they could get at, so that they would ultimately need to ask for help on occasion, but hopefully it was on occasion and not every prep that they were doing, because they had sorted and organized all these bins to be more logical for the frequency with which they're accessed, right? And obviously they were beautifully color coded and sorted by type of ingredients. But in the end, we actually did some reorganizing of this shelving system to try and make it work better for them. And we coached them through that and worked them through that feedback loop, make sure we got it right, and reviewed with them back and forth, as well as coaching them on some other things, right? Talking about some of the prep tasks that they were doing. We were working with them one-on-one of those as well, right? So that coaching element has just a really interesting place in the return to work process. All right, I think I'm out of time for today, so I want to just give you a chance to ask any more questions that you may have. And just a reminder about that LinkedIn contest. If you joined us late, or if you didn't get a chance, you just have to go to our LinkedIn page, the PROergonomics LinkedIn page, and there are several posts throughout September that have a hashtag like and share. And if you like and share those posts, you're entered into a draw for some free office ergonomic product of your choice. So that's something that hopefully you are into, and go on and join us and have some of the ergonomics love around the LinkedIn family. I'm just getting a few thank yous. I don't see any additional questions come in. If you do have questions, I'll be here for a few minutes, but I do recognize it's 1 o'clock and many of you need to get to another event or program. So if you need to sign off, that's great. And the webinar recording and things will be sent out to you once it is ready this afternoon.